I used to believe James and I had the perfect marriage. We weren't flashy, but we were happy, or at least I thought we were. James had this easy charm about him, the kind of warmth that made people gravitate toward him, and me, I was the grounded one, always cheering him on from the sidelines, proud of the life we were building together. I thought we were a team, but now that I think about it, the signs were there, subtle things. James spent more time on his phone lately, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen, while I sat next to him on the couch trying to make conversation. He laughed at texts I couldn't see and quickly locked his screen if I got too close. Work stuff, he'd say with a distracted smile, brushing off my questions. I let it go because I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? We were married at first. I convinced myself he was just stressed. His job had been demanding, and he mentioned wanting to pursue bigger projects, but as the weeks dragged on, the distance between us grew. He stopped asking about my day. He avoided date nights. Even when we were together, I felt alone, but I never imagined the real reason for his withdrawal. It happened on a Tuesday evening, one of those quiet, forgettable nights. I was making dinner when James walked into the kitchen, his face set in a way that immediately sent a chill through me. He didn't sit down or ask what we were having. Instead, he leaned against the counter, crossed his arms, and said, "We need to talk." I felt the knife slip from my hand and clatter onto the cutting board. His tone, so serious, so final, made my stomach drop. "What's wrong?" I asked, forcing a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There's no easy way to say this, Charlotte, but I think I made a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" My heart was pounding, my mind racing to fill in the blanks. I shouldn't have married you," he said, his voice slow but firm. "I've been reconnecting with Clara, my high school girlfriend, and I've realized I never really got over her." For a moment I couldn't breathe. Clara, her name felt like a punch to the gut. I hadn't thought about her in years, not since James casually mentioned her during one of our early dates. She was part of his past, a story, a memory, not a threat. How could she be the reason my husband was walking away from our life? "You're leaving me for her," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "It's not like that," James insisted, though his expression told me otherwise. "It's just with Clara, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time. It's like she gets me in a way you don't." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything we'd been through, after years of love, support, and sacrifice, he was throwing it all away for a fling with his ex. My hand shook as I gripped the edge of the counter, my voice breaking as I asked, "What about us, James? What about the life we built together?" He didn't even look me in the eye when he answered, "I can't ignore what I feel, Charlotte. I have to follow my heart." Follow his heart? As if tearing mine apart in the process didn't matter. Without another word, he walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there with the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in my ears. In the days that followed, I felt like a ghost in my own home. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of the life James and I had built together, photos on the walls, his favorite mug in the cupboard, the way his cologne still lingered in the bedroom. It was unbearable. At first I tried to make sense of it all. I replayed every moment of our marriage, searching for clues I'd missed. I thought about the nights I stayed up late helping James draft proposals for work, the sacrifices I made to support his dreams, the countless ways I put him first. How could all of that mean nothing to him? How could he choose Clara, someone who hadn't been in his life for years, over me? The worst part was the shame. I kept thinking, what's wrong with me? Was I not enough? Did I drive him away? My mind spiraled into a dark place, and for the first time in years I felt completely and utterly lost. I confided in my best friend Rachel, who was as outraged as I was heartbroken. "He's a fool, Charlotte," she said, wrapping me in a hug as I cried on her couch. "Anyone who can throw away someone like you doesn't deserve you." Her words were comforting, but they didn't erase the pain. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake in bed staring at the ceiling, haunted by the image of James and Clara together. I imagined them laughing, holding hands, building a life that should have been mine. The thought of it made my chest ache, but I couldn't stop torturing myself with the what-ifs. And yet beneath all the heartbreak, a tiny spark of anger began to grow. It wasn't fair what James had done to me. How easily he had discarded me for a fantasy. He had shattered my world without a second thought. Slowly that anger became a lifeline, pulling me out of the depths of despair. I didn't know how yet, but I promised myself one thing. I wouldn't let this be the end of my story. James might have broken my heart, but he hadn't broken me, not completely. And one day I'd show him exactly what he gave up. Months had passed since James left, but the pain still lingered like a dull ache in my chest. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the way he seemed so unaffected, like I was a chapter he'd happily closed. One day I bumped into him at a local cafe. He was with Clara. They were laughing, whispering, completely at ease, while my world still felt like it was in pieces. I didn't mean to confront Him, it just happened. I stormed over, my anger boiling over before I could stop myself. How could you? I demanded, my voice shaking. You threw me away like I meant nothing to you. James leaned back in his chair, that infuriating smirk on his face. Charlotte, you need to move on. This isn't a good look for you. The audacity of it hit me like a slap. I had given him everything, my time, my love, my loyalty. And now he was dismissing me as if I were the problem. You're unbelievable. His tears stinging my eyes. Clara sat there silent but smug, her arm looped through his like she'd won some kind of prize. I left before I could completely unravel, walking quickly to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my thoughts a chaotic storm of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. Without a destination in mind, I drove. The storm rolled in quickly, dark clouds swallowing the sky as thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain pelted my windshield, blurring my vision as I sped down the winding road. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to escape from James, from Clara, from everything. But the storm grew fiercer. The rain turned into a torrential downpour, the kind that makes you feel like the world is closing in. I should have pulled over, but I couldn't stop. I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to outrun the pain clawing at my chest, and then it happened. The tires skid on the slick pavement and I lost control. The car spun wildly before slamming into a tree with a deafening crunch. The impact sent my head snapping forward and everything went black. In the void of unconsciousness, I saw flashes of light, bright jagged streaks like lightning, and there were voices, faint whispers I couldn't make out, as if the storm had followed me into my mind. The flashes and whispers swirled together, pulling me into something I couldn't quite explain. It felt otherworldly. When I woke up, the world felt sharper, louder. The beeping of machines filled my ears and I realized I was in a hospital room. My body ached, my head throbbed, but I was alive. A nurse smiled at me, saying something about how lucky I was to have survived. Her words blurred together, but what I felt was different. It wasn't just the pain or the exhaustion, it was her. I could feel her emotions. It was faint at first, like a wave washing over me. She was calm but tired, thinking about her long shift and the cup of coffee she was going to grab when she was done. The sensation hit me so suddenly I thought I might be hallucinating, but the more I focused, the clearer it became. The nurse handed me some paperwork and left the room. I stared at the door after she left, my heart racing. What had just happened? Was this some kind of post-T trauma thing? I shook my head, trying to push the thought away, but deep down I knew something had changed after I was discharged. The sensations didn't go away. If anything, they became more intense. At first I brushed it off as paranoia or heightened anxiety after the accident, but it was impossible to ignore when I went to the grocery store to grab a few essentials. It happened again. I was standing in line at the checkout when I heard it, clear as day, but without anyone speaking. God, I hope this cashier hurries up. I can't afford to be late for work again. I froze, looking around. The man in front of me was shifting impatiently, glancing at his watch. I shouldn't have skipped breakfast. I'm starving. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my ears. Was I hearing his thoughts? No, that was impossible. I shook my head, telling myself it had to be my imagination, but then it happened again. The cashier smiled at me as she rang up my items. Her voice was cheerful, but I felt something beneath the surface, an undercurrent of exhaustion and frustration. My feet are killing me. Just 2 more hours until my break. I almost dropped my bag of groceries. This wasn't normal. It wasn't even remotely normal. I paid quickly and rushed out of the store, my mind racing. What was happening to me? Was this some kind of brain injury from the accident? Was I losing my mind? When I got home, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands. The world felt too big, too loud, like I was tuned into some frequency I couldn't turn off. I buried my face in my hands, trying to make sense of it all. The whispers, the emotions, the thoughts, they were everywhere, as overwhelming as it was a part of me. Couldn't deny the truth anymore. This wasn't a hallucination or a fluke. Something had changed after the accident. Something inside me had awakened, and while I had no idea how to control it or if I even wanted to, I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't ignore it. The first few weeks after discovering my ability were a blur of confusion and trial and error. I felt like I was trapped in a room full of voices and no one would turn the volume down. But the more I experimented, the more I started to understand how it worked. It wasn't like a constant flood of thoughts, more like tuning into a radio station. If I focused, I could listen more clearly, but if I let myself panic, the noise became overwhelming. I also realized physical closeness amplified the effect. The closer I was to someone, the stronger the emotions I could feel, and the louder their thoughts became. At first, I was terrified of what this ability meant, but deep down, a small part of me wondered, could this be a gift? One morning, I woke up determined to see if this power could be useful. It started small, like the way I could hear my barista thinking about offering me a free coffee because their manager wasn't around. I declined. It felt weird to exploit that, but it got me thinking. The first real breakthrough came when I had to renegotiate my lease. My landlord was a notoriously stingy man who never budged on anything. As I sat across from him in his cluttered office, I picked up on his guilt. I know the rent is too high, but the market allows it. She probably can't afford it, but I need the money. I leaned in. You know, this building has so much potential, but I've been struggling with the rent. Maybe if you knocked it down by just a little, I could afford to invest in fixing up my unit. It would add value to the building. His eyebrows shot up, and for a moment I could hear his internal battle. She's not wrong. It's just $100 fine. It's not like anyone else is renting that place soon. He sighed and agreed to lower the rent. I walked out of that office with my first real win in months. For the first time since James left, I felt like I was in control again. I quickly realized that if I was going to use this ability without letting it consume me, I needed control. That meant learning to shut out the noise and focus only when I wanted to. So I did what any overwhelmed person in need of clarity does. I Googled meditation, and mindfulness became my lifeline. At first it was excruciating trying to sit still while my mind buzzed with everyone else's thoughts, but the more I practiced, the easier it became. I learned to picture a dial in my head, turning the volume down when I didn't want to hear anything and turning it up when I needed to focus. I started testing myself in crowded places like the park or the grocery store. Instead of being overwhelmed by everyone's emotions, I learned to focus on one person at a time. It was like flexing a muscle I didn't know I had. Of course, there were setbacks. Sometimes I'd let my guard down and be flooded by someone's anger or sadness, leaving me shaken, but I kept practicing. The more control I gained, the more confident I became. Just as I was beginning to feel like I was getting my life together, the universe threw me a curveball. I was at a friend's gathering, a rare night out I'd forked myself to attend. When ISP sped them James's and Clara, my heart sank, but I forced myself to stay calm. I reminded myself of everything I'd been through and all the progress I'd made. I wasn't the same person who begged James to stay. I was stronger now, so instead of running, I stayed and observed. They didn't see me at first, which gave me the chance to listen, and James was standing near the appetizers nursing a drink. I don't know if I made the right choice, he thought, his eyes darting to Clara, who was chatting animatedly with a group of people. She's so demanding. I miss how easy things were with Charlotte. I swallowed hard. Hearing that should have made me feel triumphant, but all I felt was sadness for the woman I used to be, the one who loved James unconditionally. Then I turned my attention to Clara. Her thoughts were sharper, more calculated. If James doesn't step up soon, I'll have to make a backup plan. He's useless without me pushing him. She glanced at James with a faint smirk. He's lucky I even gave him a chance. My chest tightened, but not out of pain, out of clarity. James had left me for a fantasy, and Clara had used him just as much as he'd used me. Their relationship was built on lies and manipulation, and for the first time I didn't envy them. I pied them. They eventually spotted me, and James's face froze. Clara gave me a tightly smile, clearly uncomfortable. I returned her smile with the politest "don't try me" look I could muster. James, however, looked unfed. Charlotte, he started, but I held up a hand. Don't, I said, my voice steady. Enjoy your evening. I walked away before either of them could respond, my heart pounding, but my head held high. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. Not because I'd humiliated them, but because I finally saw the truth. That encounter with James and Clara solidified something in me. I realized that my power wasn't just about reading thoughts or emotions. It was about seeing people for who they really were, and now that I'd seen the cracks in their perfect facade, I knew exactly what I had to do. I wasn't going to waste another moment on them. Instead, I was going to focus on building a life so incredible they'd never even dare to take credit for it. When James left, it felt like the end of the world, but now it feels like the beginning of something better, something mine. I decided to put everything I had into starting over. Using my powers wasn't just about eavesdropping on people's thoughts. It became a way to truly understand what others needed. That's how I got the idea for my consulting business. The concept was simple: helping businesses and individuals communicate better and anticipate the needs of their customers, employees, or clients. What made it extraordinary was my secret weapon, my ability to tune into what people truly thought and felt. At first, it was just a few small contracts helping local businesses tailor their marketing or improve their client relationships. Word spread quickly. Charlotte just gets it, one client said, and soon I had a steady stream of work. For the first time in years, I felt proud of myself. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Rebuilding my life wasn't just about work, though. It was about finding myself again. During my marriage, I'd given up so much of who I was to fit into James' world. Now I had the freedom to explore the things I loved. I dusted off my old sketchbooks, rediscovering my passion for drawing and design. I joined a local art class where I met people who shared my interests. I even started running again, feeling the strength return to my body with each mile. The more I poured into myself, the more my confidence grew. I wasn't just Charlotte, the woman James left behind. I was Charlotte, a business owner, an artist, a runner, and someone who had survived heartbreak and come out stronger. And for the first time in a long time, I was happy. I also began to rebuild my social life. My best friend Rachel had always been my rock, but now I was branching out, forming new friendships, people who valued me for who I was, not for how I could fit into their expectations. Of course, I couldn't resist checking in on James and Clara every now and then. It was like peeking through a window into their world, a world I was no longer part of, but one that had once caused me so much pain. What I learned was both satisfying and bittersweet. Clara, the woman who had seemed so perfect and put together, was far from it. Through her thoughts, I uncovered her insecurities. She constantly worried about her looks, her social standing, and most of all, her control over James. She played him like a violin, feeding his insecurities and stroking his ego just enough to keep him hooked. If he starts questioning me, I'll remind him how miserable he was with Charlotte. Clara thought once during a dinner party, "It always works, he's so predictable." I couldn't help but smirk. Clara might have James wrapped around her finger, but it wasn't because of love, it was manipulation, plain and simple. As for James, his thoughts were a mess of regret and denial. His financial situation had taken a hit thanks to Clara's extravagant spending habits. He was burdened with debt and struggling to keep up appearances, and while he wouldn't admit it out loud, his thoughts betrayed him. Charlotte would never have let things get this bad. She always kept us grounded. Hearing that didn't fill me with the satisfaction I thought it would. If anything, it made me pity him. James had thrown away a solid, loving marriage for a mirage, and now he was drowning in the consequences. Despite my curiosity about their lives, I made one rule for myself: I wouldn't let their downfall consume me. I had worked too hard to rebuild my confidence and independence to let James and Clara pull me back into the past, so I kept my distance both physically and emotionally. If I peeked into their thoughts, it was only to remind myself of how far I'd come. They were a chapter one had closed, and I refused to let their drama overshadow my new story. My business continued to grow, and with it my sense of accomplishment. I hired a small team of like-minded individuals who shared my passion for helping people. Together we worked on projects that felt meaningful, whether it was helping a struggling business find its voice or mentoring young professionals trying to navigate their careers. I found joy in using my powers for good, not revenge. There was something incredibly fulfilling about understanding people on such a deep level and using that knowledge to make their lives better. It gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. One evening, as I sat in my cozy apartment sketching ideas for a new project, I reflected on how far I'd come. The woman who had begged James to stay, who had questioned her worth because of his betrayal, felt like a stranger to me now. I still thought about the betrayal sometimes, how it had hurt, how it had broken me, but instead of feeling bitterness, I felt gratitude. If James hadn't left, I might never have discovered my own strength. I might never have started my business, rekindled my passions, or learned how to truly value myself. I had risen from the ashes of my old life, and I was building something beautiful. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held. I didn't know if James and Clara's relationship was last, or if they'd eventually tear each other apart. And honestly, I didn't care. My life wasn't about them anymore. It was about me, my business, my passions, my friends, and the bright future I was building for myself. I fell asleep with a smile, feeling truly free for the first time in years. It started as a nagging curiosity I couldn't ignore. Clara was always such a picture-perfect person, always saying the right things, smiling at the right times, but something about her never felt genuine. It wasn't just the betrayal of stealing James away, it was the way she seemed to bask in the drama, always putting herself in the spotlight. So I decided to dig a little deeper. After all, what was the point of having these powers if I couldn't use them to uncover the truth? Using my abilities, I started to pick up on patterns in Clara's thoughts during social events. I tuned into the fleeting whispers in her mind, the stray thoughts. She couldn't hide. If he doesn't close this deal soon, we'll need to cut back. No more trips, or I need him to buy that necklace before he figures out the accounts. But the real breakthrough came when I hired a private investigator just to confirm what I already suspected. The investigator pieced together a disturbing pattern. Clara had a history of latching onto wealthy, successful men, draining them dry and then moving on to her next target. She had left a trail of broken marriages and drained bank accounts, each more damaging than the last. She wasn't just manipulative, she Was calculated. Clara was a professional gold digger armed with this knowledge. I debated how best to handle it. A part of me wanted to confront James, to lay everything out and watch his face crumble as he realized the extent of Clara's deception, but that felt too easy and too much like something the old me would have done. This new version of myself had learned patience. I didn't need to throw the truth in James's face. I just needed to plant seeds of death out and let him discover it for himself. It started with small casual conversations at social events or in professional circles where James and Clara were known. I'd let slip little pieces of information, nothing too obvious, just enough to make people curious. Oh, I heard Clara lived in Paris for a while. I'd say figging casual interest. Didn't her first husband own a chain of restaurants there? What was his name again? Or it's amazing how Clara bounces back so quickly after her divorces. She must be incredibly resilient. I didn't lie. I didn't need to. The truth was damning enough on its own. Slowly but surely people began to notice the cracks in Clara's perfect image. Her charm wasn't quite as convincing when people started looking at her through a more skeptical lens. At first James defended Clara fiercely. He dismissed the rumors claiming people were jealous of her. She's just misunderstood, he'd say. But as Clara's manipulations became harder to ignore, his confidence in her began to waver. One evening I overheard James's thoughts at a business event. He was standing with a colleague who casually mentioned Clara's reputation. And I could feel his internal conflict. No, that's not true, but what if it is? I mean, she has been spending a lot lately, and why does she always change the subject when I bring up finances? It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep me going. Over time Clara's behavior became more erratic. She'd lash out at James in private, accusing him of not supporting her enough, of not being the man she thought he was. She'd guilt trip him into buying her extravagant gifts, playing on his insecurities to keep him under her thumb. And then finally the breaking point came. James found discrepancies in their shared accounts, large withdrawals Clara couldn't explain away. When he pressed her for answers, she deflected, growing defensive and angry. "You're supposed to trust me," she screamed, but even her theatrics couldn't hide the truth. James began to see her for what she really was. Watching James's world crumble should have felt satisfying. After all, he had left me for this woman, believing she was his perfect match, but instead of joy I felt a deep sense of clarity. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about me proving to myself that I was better off without them, both of them. I resisted the urge to confront James directly, even when he started reaching out to me with guilt-ridden messages. "Hey, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime," he texted. Once I deleted the message without replying. I wasn't the same woman he had left behind, desperate for scraps of his attention. I had built a life that didn't revolve around him or his validation. My business was thriving, my friendships were stronger than ever, and for the first time in years I felt like I was truly in control of my own story. Instead of focusing on James and Clara, I poured my energy into growing my company and mentoring young women in my community. I started a program to help women in difficult situations regain their confidence and independence, sharing some of the lessons I had learned the hard way. There was something poetic about the way things had unfolded. James had left me for a fantasy, only to watch that fantasy shatter under the weight of its own lies. And Clara, she had played her game well, but even the best manipulators can't keep up the act forever. As for me, I had moved on, not just from James and Clara, but from the version of myself that had once tied her worth to someone else's approval. My powers may have given me an edge, but it was my resilience, my determination, and my self-belief that truly carried me forward. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need closure. All I needed was the life I had built for myself, a life where I was free, confident, and unshakably strong. If someone had told me 2 years ago that my life would look like this, I wouldn't have believed. Then my consulting business wasn't just surveying, it was thriving. What started as a modest idea born out of necessity had blossomed into a full-fledged agency, one that was gaining serious attention. The media began taking notice after a high-profile client credited me for turning their struggling company into a success story. Soon my inbox was flooded with interview requests, and my story was featured in several major outlets. Rising star Charlotte Taylor. I still remember the headline that made me laugh out loud. Who would have thought I'd end up inspiring others? It wasn't just about the success or the recognition, though. I had built something that was entirely mine. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was living in someone else's shadow or trying to prove my worth to someone who didn't see it. This was my triumph, and no one could take it from me. Success wasn't just about the numbers in my bank account or the accolades in the press. It was about the person I was becoming, the Heartbreak and betrayal that once defined me felt like distant memories. I still carried them, sure, but they no longer weighed me down. Through therapy, journaling, and self-reflection, I had come to terms with what had happened. James's betrayal wasn't my failure, it was his. I realized I'd spent years diminishing myself trying to fit into a mold of the perfect wife that never truly existed. Now I was unapologetically me. I reconnected with old friends I had lost touch with during my marriage, and even made new ones. My relationships were deeper and more genuine now, built on mutual respect and shared values, and for the first time I was open to the idea of love again, not because I needed it but because I finally knew my worth. While my star was rising, James' life was falling apart. It was hard not to hear about it. Our mutual friends, the ones who stuck by me, relished giving me updates. Clara had finally shown her true colors once James's finances dried up and she realized he couldn't fund her lifestyle anymore. She left him for another wealthy man, taking whatever she could on her way out. Their breakup wasn't quiet either. Rumors swirled about their heated arguments, her public scenes, and his desperate attempts to win her back. As if that wasn't bad enough, James's professional reputation took a nosedive. His impulsive decisions, many of which had been influenced by Clara's manipulations, left his business in shambles. He lost key clients, faced legal troubles due to questionable deals, and found himself increasingly isolated. The same social circle that had once admired him now gossiped about his downfall. Part of me felt vindicated. How could I not? But mostly I felt pity. James had sacrificed everything for an illusion, and now he was left with nothing. One day, while I was reviewing proposals for a new project, my phone buzzed with a message that stopped me in my tracks. It was from James. Charlotte, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you, please. It's important. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. What could he possibly want? I hadn't heard from him directly since our divorce. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to block his number, and move on with my day, but curiosity and maybe a lingering thread of empathy got the better of me. I agreed to meet him in a neutral public space, setting clear boundaries. In my reply, this wasn't about rekindling anything, this was about closure. I needed to hear what he had to say, if only to finally lay the past to rest. James looked like a shadow of the man I had once loved. He was thinner, his eyes hollow, and his usually confident demeanor was replaced with something I could only describe as desperation. He fidgeted with his coffee cup as I sat across from him, calm and composed. Thank you for meeting me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded but didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. He shifted uncomfortably before diving into his plea. I know I messed up, Charlotte. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted to tell you how sorry I am. I didn't realize what I had until it was gone. His words hung in the air, but they didn't have the impact he probably hoped for. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't anything really. I watched him carefully, using the powers I rarely needed anymore. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of regret and self-pity. He wasn't lying, but his apology wasn't entirely selfless either. He wanted something from me. You hurt me, James the first said, my voice steady. You didn't just leave me, you discarded me. And for what? For someone who only saw you as a bank account. That's not my burden to fix. He flinched but nodded as if he knew this moment was inevitable. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I guess I wanted to say it out loud, to admit that I was wrong. I left the meeting feeling lighter than I had in years. James's apology didn't change anything, but it gave me the closure I didn't realize I still needed. He had finally acknowledged what he did, and I had finally let it go. This wasn't about revenge or proving a point anymore. My life wasn't defined by what James did to me, it was defined by what I did for myself. And as I walked away from that coffee shop, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for far too long. My business was expanding into new markets. My friendships were stronger than ever, and I was even considering opening a second office in another city. Life was full of possibilities, and for the first time I wasn't afraid to embrace them. James's downfall was tragic, but it wasn't my story. My story was one of resilience, strength, and transformation. And I knew that no matter what came next, I was ready to face it head on.